welcome back. We're now joined by Sam to get us all to get radical. Sam works at the intersection of feminism, human rights, and technology. She's currently program lead for Digital Rights Watch and a privacy and technology specialist with Sullinger Privacy. With experience across the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, and a background in both politics and data science, Sam thinks an interdisciplinary approach to privacy is vital. As former program director for Code Like a Girl, Sam is dedicated to ethics of technology in all its forms, from gender equity in the tech industry to upholding privacy in an increasingly surveillance-obsessed world. Sam is also going to use all the time because it's just so much amazing information to cram in. So if you have any questions, please make a note of them and ask them in the hallway track after the talk. Take it away, Sam.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm just going to take these out. Okay. So, hi. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here. So I want to thank you to PyCon and in particular to Snake Oil Academy for creating this space where we can really nerd out about privacy and security. It's a really special thing to have and to be able to participate in. So, as this slide suggests, I'm going to be talking about privacy as a collective issue. So this is one of my favorite topics, and I'm really excited to have you here and to bring you along on this journey. So, as far as I see it, as governments and companies continue to use technology to meet their thirst for surveillance, protecting privacy is one of the key ways that we can push back. And I think that's really, really cool. And I hope that by the end of this talk, you think so too. And if you already feel that way, I hope that I leave you feeling energized and excited to embed really good privacy practices and protections into any projects that you might work on in the future. As we'll get into a little bit later, I think that using privacy as a tool can mean so much more than just meeting our compliance requirements. It can also help shape the kind of technology that we build and, in turn, the world that we create. So I am coming at you from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge the sovereignty of these lands was never ceded and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any First Nations people who might be here today. Thank you so much for being here. I also want to highlight that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about surveillance, and I think it's really important that we keep in mind that surveillance has intrinsic connections with colonization and colonial policing, and this was and continues to be about policing race and class. We need to remember throughout this talk, and whenever we think about privacy, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to be disproportionately surveilled and policed. I'm also going to talk a bit about this idea of extractivism, this obsession with collection and ever more collecting data and personal information. This too is a concept that is rooted in white supremacy and capitalism and colonization. So we should never forget that, and I think throughout this talk it's good to keep that context in mind. So today's talk is essentially my love letter to privacy. Privacy isn't a perfect tool. It can't solve all of the problems. In fact, sometimes it can cause problems. It can be a double-edged sword. But I think it's absolutely essential if we want to build technology that fosters the kind of future that we want, one that is free and fair and sustainable, and one that respects people and communities rather than exploiting and policing them. I am, of course, making a few assumptions here. I mean, maybe you want the kind of future, depicted in some dystopian sci-fi novel where there is no privacy, and everyone knows everything about everyone at all times. But I think that you being here indicates that you really want to create a better world and believe that technology can be a really important way to propel that. I mean, I certainly do. But at the same time, if we can agree that the current trajectory that we're on, one which relies on mass data collection and surveillance, that if we can agree that this causes immense harm, both when it's done by governments as part of a broader surveillance and policing agenda, or when it's done by companies as part of surveillance capitalism. If we can agree that this is causing harm, then privacy is one of the key ways that we can push back. But we can't push back in any kind of meaningful way if we fixate on privacy as an individual issue. We need to see it as a collective one. So my goal is to get you all thinking about privacy, maybe in a different way than you have before, or maybe not. What I ideally want is that you leave this talk feeling emboldened about privacy and really want to incorporate it into your work, rather than it being, a burden or something that's limiting or, the worst, just a compliance tick box exercise. So here's what I have planned. So let's just dig in. So we've reached the dreaded portion of any talk on privacy where the speaker tries to define it. And the reason it's dreaded is because it's just such a notoriously difficult concept to define. And I think that this is one of the problems that we face, is that in any discussion about privacy, we're using one word to try to describe all different kinds of concepts and theories and essentially approaches to information management. So when people talk about privacy, it could really be in reference to any or even many of these words and others. And I think we can agree that this is a massive undertaking for one word. So looking here, we've got, pick out a few. The to be let alone, that's kind of the classic definition, this idea that we should be free from interference. Control, to be able to exercise control about, where our personal information goes and who gets it and what happens. And this is also tied up in ideas of consent and choice. Self-determination, dignity, being able to develop one's personhood and personality. Secrecy is in my opinion, a problematic one. Privacy and secrecy often get kind of used interchangeably, and I think it's honestly, in my opinion, one of the least nuanced and most problematic ways to think about privacy. Bell Hooks, who is a renowned social activist and feminist, once said, "Open, honest, truth-telling individuals value privacy. We all need spaces where we can be alone with our thoughts and feelings, where we can experience healthy psychological autonomy and choose to share what we want to. Keeping secrets is usually about power, about hiding and concealing information." And when we think about it like this, I would say that the government is way more interested in secrecy than we are as a collective. Intimacy is an interesting one because it starts to play in this space of privacy being able to expand and contract, to be able to let people in. So it's not just an individual thing, it's something that we can welcome others into. And of course, anonymity, which is not only really hard to say, but is also, I think, worth paying a little bit more attention to, because privacy and anonymity often get conflated. And in my experience working as a privacy consultant, this is often where people fall down. So anonymity generally refers to when information or actions or whatever is kept separate from our name or other identifying features. But anonymity is also really fragile. It's really not that challenging to identify someone using only a few data points. So this was shown way back in 2000 by Latanya Sweeney in the US, who showed that 87% of Americans could be uniquely identified by just their zip code, gender, and date of birth. More recently, I'm sure many of you are probably aware of the work that Vanessa Teague and Ben Rubenstein and Chris Colnane have done at the University of Melbourne, where they exposed just how simple it was to re-identify individuals from de-identified data. And the protection offered by anonymity is really minimal when it comes to something like surveillance capitalism, because frankly, companies don't really care about our identity as much as they care about our profile. And so this is where people sort of fall into this trap that I mentioned. They, in the process of designing an initiative or a project, they'll say something to me like, well, we don't actually know who they are. We don't collect their name, so it's not invading privacy. But the trouble is that you can cause all kinds of harm to people without ever actually knowing who they are. And this can still be an invasion of privacy. So targeted marketing and behavioral advertising is is an example of this, of using what is called individuation. So this means that, the company may not know who I am, they may not know my name is Sam, but they know my social and political and economic preferences, which is determined by the data that has been collected about me and the inferences that they've made based on that data. They use this to create essentially an abstract identity, which is then in turn used to influence me, to offer me highly personalized advertising or messaging, which is really just a fancy form of manipulation. And because all of this happens behind the scenes, generally without people ever really knowing about it, it curtails our ability to control the information that's out there about us. These kinds of companies and data brokers, they're not interested in who I am as a person. They're interested in me as an entity that emits data that they can vacuum up. They're interested in me as someone who buys things and someone who can be influenced to buy more things. And when you start thinking about this kind of power to influence and how this can be used in areas other than in commercial and retail spaces, that's when it starts getting particularly scary. Because there's quite a difference between being influenced to buy a pair of shoes, for example, compared with being influenced to believe a certain political ideology, or to be influenced to be led to believe particular kinds of health information or misinformation, or to vote for a particular politician. But the underlying approach is the same. So anonymity, while essential in lots of respects, can create a bit of a false sense of privacy. And so one thing is clear is that there's so much going on here. There's so much happening. And this is one of the troubles, as I mentioned. This wobbly, non-fixed social construct that we call privacy that morphs and changes and shifts and evolves over time is really wobbly. And one of the questions that I think we need to think about is, should we narrow this down? Should we try to just focus in on one particular aspect of it that could be more regulatorable, more easily regulated, or should we take a more expansive view? And this offers lots of different opportunities, but it also makes it kind of hard to grapple with. I think, as you'll see, I lean towards expansive, but, that is certainly a question to think about. So I think it's worth having a look at some history to contextualize what I mean by privacy as a collective issue. There's plenty to dig into in ancient history about ideas of privacy and the personal and the political, but I think that's going a little bit too far back for our purposes. So less to say that the concept of privacy has been around for a really long time. But the idea of the right to privacy started to emerge in the late 1800s, particularly when American lawyers Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis wrote a famous article on the right to privacy, which they described as the right to be let alone. So it was closely tied up in this idea of private property and ownership. And then fast forward to the 1960s, and Alan Weston published Privacy and Freedom, where he described the right to privacy in terms of self-determination and personal autonomy. And obviously there are lots more things along the way in this path, but the point that I want to get to is that all of these ideas are really focused in on privacy being seen as an individual issue. And along the way, it has really formed this association with privacy and libertarianism. Of course. So libertarianism, as a refresher, is a political philosophy which holds, as the name suggests, liberty as a core principle. Libertarians seek to maximize autonomy, political freedom. They emphasize freedom of association, freedom of choice, and individualism. And libertarians are generally really skeptical of authority and state power. So there's lots of good things in there. And, it sounds okay when you put it like that. But of course, as with any ideology, there are many schools of thought under the one umbrella. And while libertarianism does have a history of association with the left, over the last century or so, it's really become very strongly associated with more right-wing politics, with ideas of conservatism and free market capitalism, and an emphasis on property rights and on ownership. And in my opinion, where it falls down is that it centers the individual to a fault, overlooking our collective interests, intersectionality, or the needs and experiences of marginalized groups. So privacy for a really long time has kind of hung out in this libertarian club. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not the only way that we can think about privacy. And personally, I think that if we want to leverage privacy as a way to facilitate more positive social change, we need to be thinking about it as a collective issue. So that means instead of focusing on me and my data and my right to be let alone, we frame privacy as a collective social good, worthy of protection, not just to protect ourselves as individuals, but to protect and empower communities. And when you think about it, the whole argument of like, well, I've got nothing to hide, so I've got nothing to fear, that is squarely caught up in individualism. It's not always about you as an individual, because loss of privacy impacts all of us. So thankfully, we're starting to see a shift in the way that we hear about privacy being spoken about it being framed as a public good. So Shoshana Zuboff in The Age of Capitalism said that the belief that privacy is private is the most treacherous hallucination of them all. And that's because the impact of losing privacy is shared. So there's a number of ways that this can happen. Perhaps the easiest place to start is this sense that your privacy will be impacted by the choices or actions of those around you. So for example, you might decide not to be on social media to protect your privacy, but that doesn't prevent other people from sharing information about you. It also doesn't prevent the platforms from tracking you around the internet. Another example is with the increased use of machine learning. So just by merely sharing characteristics with people who may or may not have willingly shared their data can result in you being impacted by inferences or decisions that's made on that data. So that data wasn't collected about you, it was collected about other people who are similar to you. But then this can play out in things like applications for home loans, insurance, or even applying for work. And then, of course, possibly the biggest issue of all is that invasions or loss of privacy can have societal level impacts. So if we take Cambridge Analytica as an example, this shows that when privacy is threatened, our democratic processes can falter. And so all of this suggests that privacy is a collective, networked good, rather than purely individualistic. Okay, so lots of talk of privacy often focuses on it as a state of being, as something that we have. You know, we have it, I have privacy, or I don't have privacy. It also gets very caught up in, theory and philosophy, which, we've done that portion of the talk. But I think that there is value in considering privacy and the act of upholding it as something more active, as a tool that we can use. So we all know that governments and companies are busy accumulating masses of data, including our personal information. And as they do this, the existing power imbalances between them and us grows larger. And as more and more of our lives are online, our personal life, dating, health, work, accessing essential government services, all of these aspects of our lives are becoming integrated with digital technology. And as this is happening, the power shifts towards those who control the technological systems and those who collect and hold the data. So alongside this is this sense that digital technology is, treated like a force of nature. It is inevitable and unstoppable. And we, as individuals and communities, we are treated as objects that technology happens to, rather than active participants with agency who, have a desire to shape the technology and the future. So I think that we can use privacy as a tool and as a way to examine and interrogate information flows, which is in turn a good method for examining power structures. So if we imagine these structures as something that relies on like a complex framework of information gathering and sharing, I like to imagine like a construction of pipes, pumping data around, sucking it out of individuals and communities and pumping it towards governments and companies. So if we look at it this way, protecting privacy can be used as a tool to look at these structures, the pipes, and to renegotiate the bounds of where the pipes go and what data flows through them. And by prioritizing privacy protections, we can redistribute this power in, I hope, a more distributed way. And as such, upholding privacy can be an act of resistance. Digital surveillance is highly efficient as a way to enforce social order. It makes us conform, it helps create a culture of compliance, and it generates social consequences for any behaviour that deviates from the norm. Protecting privacy is one way that we can resist this. Upholding privacy enables us to take some power back. It enables us to see how governments and companies are using our personal information for their own profit or agenda, and to say no. To be able to maintain a level of autonomy and dignity in a world where increasingly everything is knowable and traceable. So many people lament the end of privacy. Like, oh, privacy is dead, why bother? Why resist, But it's not. At least I don't think it is. It's not dead. In fact, the ongoing moves to undermine it by governments and companies just goes to show how much it isn't dead and how much it threatens them. So this tweet from Eva Galperin was at the same time that the Pegasus project came to light, which was a coordinated surveillance effort between international law enforcement agencies. And I think that it rings really true. We really cannot succumb to privacy fatalism, because that is exactly what would benefit governments and companies who want us to give up on it and to allow them to continue to exploit the information that they have. Protecting privacy is how we resist. Privacy is also an essential component to any political movement, any organising, any attempt to challenge the status quo. So in this sense, protecting privacy is both an act of resistance in and of itself, as well as a tool to enable organisations and communities to push for important social progression. If you just think about any social movement, any progression that we've had over the past, century, would any of that have been possible if they didn't have the ability to retain some level of privacy? We know that governments do not appreciate people who are trying to challenge the power structures of the status quo. It's no coincidence that activists are some of the most heavily surveilled among us. So protecting privacy is how we ensure that we maintain a healthy amount of political engagement and pressure. And not only that, but the right to privacy can enable other rights and freedoms. For example, did you know that the right to privacy is the reason that the US Supreme Court decided that prohibiting access to abortion and contraception was unconstitutional? A pivotal moment in history of reproductive rights was achieved based on the notion of privacy. And while there certainly is debate about whether or not that was the right, rationale behind the decision, it does go to show that the right to privacy can really pave the way for social progression. And this brings me to my next point, that privacy can be a way to facilitate intersectional harm reduction. It should go without saying that, harms caused by loss or invasion of privacy or privacy breaches, they don't impact everyone equally. Systems of oppression are increasingly enabled by technologies using, such as things like facial recognition technology or automated decision-making, machine learning, and all of these require immense amounts of personal information in order to function. And what we're seeing at the moment is an exacerbation of inequality, amplified by technology, which is fueled by invasive and extractive data practices. So upholding privacy by limiting the collection, use, and storage and sharing of personal information is a vital part of reducing harm across intersections. So let's look at a couple of examples just to sort of wrap a head around this. So, women have been policed and observed for centuries. Until very recently, they were considered not to have any privacy at all when it comes to sexual propriety. Sex workers continue to be policed and surveilled more than most groups online, and when their privacy is invaded, it's generally not taken seriously by those in power. And privacy has played a really big role in the history of LGBTQ+ rights. You remember how I mentioned that privacy helped in the fight for reproductive rights? Well, that same argument was then later used to decriminalize homosexuality in the US as well. But it's not all good. Privacy invasive laws and policies have also been used to oppress and stigmatize people based on their sexuality and their gender expression for decades. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, Surveillance and colonization go hand in hand. Pictured here is my friend Kat, who highlighted in a discussion about facial recognition technology that if we want a future in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are not overrepresented in prisons, then this is incompatible. This reality is incompatible with rampant surveillance. So strong privacy protections is not only a way to, it's not the only way to stop this from happening. There's lots of factors at play here, but it is a key ingredient in reducing harm caused by over-policing, which relies on surveillance. So when we consider privacy as a collective issue rather than just an individual one, we can start to see how the impacts are so much bigger than just me and my data. And it means we can start to use it as a tool to push back, to protect communities and to look after one another. And I think, in turn, to create a more equitable future. But all of this is not without its tensions. And a little content note, I'm about to just mention some gendered violence, just a little heads up. If that's not for you today, you can jump out. So I mentioned right at the beginning that privacy can be a double-edged sword. And I think a prime example of that is in the realm of gendered and family violence. So for a long time, privacy was weaponized against women and gender diverse folks as a cover for widespread abuse and violence, keeping things behind closed doors. But now, as we're seeing a shift towards how we think about privacy and also a shift in terms of gender politics and our understanding, modern ideas of privacy are certainly not a call to go back to hiding abusive behavior from view. And so what makes things a little bit more complicated as well is that privacy is absolutely vital for many victim survivors and their protection. So privacy, like many things, can be weaponized if we let it, but can be a tool for progression on the flip side. So we need a liberating rather than a restrictive view of privacy. So in Net Privacy, Sasha Molitoris says that privacy has the potential to be both liberating and stifling. And the challenge is to conceptualize more clearly a positive privacy. That is, we want a privacy that affords liberty instead of confinement. We want a privacy in service of equity. And I just think that just nails it on the head. So we're getting towards the end now, so let's just quickly reflect on some of the kinds of values that are currently embedded in privacy invasive approaches. So currently, there's this huge focus on extractivism. As I said before at the beginning, this need to collect everything, to mine and extract and exploit and profit. This clearly aligns with how, the environment is being exploited as well. If data is the new oil, then we are fracking people for their personal information. It's also grounded in policing, in watching and being watched, in treating everyone as a possible suspect, in carceral and punitive approaches. And there is a complete lack of respect for boundaries. Privacy invasive technology just storms in, forces consent, takes your personal information, influences you, and then tells you that you consented to it all. So there's nothing inevitable about this. We can change the way that things are going, and you guessed it, I think that upholding privacy as a collective issue is the way to get there. So I've got some quotes here from Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a writer and activist who I admire, and she really emphasizes this idea of imagining and being creative about how we want to build futures. So what might the world look like where privacy was recognized and respected and upheld as a collective good? Would we be able to think more radically about the possibilities of technology to build things that would not be for the purpose of selling things, but to enrich and uplift the collective well-being? Would we be able to reject this idea that we must trade our privacy for safety, convenience, and connection? So to wrap up, I want to leave you to consider not just how we might use privacy as a tool to push back against current power imbalances, but how we might use privacy and perceive privacy as a guiding principle towards creating better structures altogether, based on something that isn't centered on extractivism, policing, and control. I don't want to, just build more walls with privacy, to be a blocker, to say no to technological innovation. Rather, I want privacy to be seen as a collective good, to help us imagine new ways of thinking about tech and data and how we can shape it to build a better future for all of us. Thank you so much for listening and paying attention.
Thank you so much. It was so good. There are some really cool chats going on as well, so I'm trying not to be totally off camera. It's really good. If you guys have any questions, please jump into the hallway afterwards, and we'll be back in about 15 minutes with our next talk.